Ajay Godavarthi, who will be talking about gender and Muslim politics beyond Islamophobia. And before I go to Ajay, just a brief introduction about Dr. Ajay Godavarthi. Well, in fact, he completed his PhD in 2003 from the Center for Political Studies, JNU, New Delhi. His thesis was titled as Fragmentation and Solidarity, a study of caste, class, and gender movements in Andhra Pradesh, which is a study of the interface between the three political movements. His first teaching assignment was at the National University of Juridical Sciences, Kolkata, from 2001 to 2003. Of course, here he taught, apart from political science, the constitutional history of India. From 2003 to 2006, he was at the National Law School, Bangalore. And then, in fact, his areas of research interest include political theory, especially critical theory. And I just want to add here that he has been teaching at the Center for Political Studies, CPS, that is, in JNU from 2006. Okay. And so his major areas of research include political theory, especially critical theory, contemporary political movements, post-colonial theory, and debates on civil society. As part of engaging with these areas, he edited a critical volume titled Reframing Democracy and Agency in India, which was published in 2012 by Anthem London. He has published a book entitled Politics of Post-Civil Society, Contemporary History of Political Movements in India in 2013, Sage, Delhi. And here he tried to argue that contemporary political movements, including the human rights, Dalit, Naxalite, feminist, and collective against new industrialization, are pushing and nudging towards a new kind of politics of post-civil society. His current research has been around contemporary developments in Indian democracy after globalization, and where he's attempting to take a fresh look at the interface between these two currents. And he's been trying to look at the possibility of theorizing as to how post-colonial theory and liberal politics in India belong to the same epistemic community. These, in course of time, should develop into research papers and publish monographs. And, in fact, he has completed many international projects, at different places, in different, countries. And he has written lots of academic writings, and has been contributing regularly to news dailies, which like The Hindu, Indian Express, Deccan Herald, Hans India, among others. Of course, as I mentioned, he's written a couple of books, edited a couple of books, and has been a prolific writer in the media on contemporary issues, defining politics and understanding the political strands in the country and the world as such. Well, I can go on and on. It's a long bio that I have of, Ajay. But I will give it to Ajay now to speak on gender and Muslim politics beyond Islamophobia. After his presentation, we'll open it for discussion. So you all are most welcome to ask your questions for clarifications. So over to you, Dr. Ajay.
Thank you, thank you, Dr. Indu. I'm audible?
Yeah, you're audible, very much audible. Yeah, please go ahead.
Fine, great. And let me also thank Arjun, Arjan's friend, who took the initiative to organize this. And I really gather the institute seems to be very active with lots of talks. I see them on the website, that there are quite a few videos posted there. So what I wish to really do today is to revisit the relevance of gender in the current context, in the entire political economy and the political and the social context that we are living through, which is marked by a certain kind of a cultural majoritarian turn. And my general sense is that gender, I think, would be a very important entry point into this in terms of deconstructing cultural majoritarianism. But for that, the other important link one needs to really understand is how does one frame Muslim politics in India today? And much of it, I think we would all agree that there has been a growing sense of intimidation, violence, and exclusion, including the current debate on NRC and CAA around the plight of religious minorities, especially the Muslims. But much of this, the current situation of the Muslims is being politically countered through the discourse of Islamophobia. That there is a blanket usage of this term of Islamophobia, that everything is put into this basket, that every kind of a debate is, in a sense, remains scuttled because of this kind of a blanket framing. And my attempt would be to sort of open it up and argue that there is actually no Islamophobia in India, that this is actually a borrowed term, much from the North American and European context. And what we do have in India is what I refer to in course of my writings as contextual communalism. That we need to make a conceptual distinction between communalism and Islamophobia. Communalism, I think, is a much real, complex phenomena that is linked to socio-cultural issues and political and economic issues. That it has also to do with a sense of memory of the nation, and it's also linked with the concrete cultural differences, everyday cultural differences and social ethics. And I think it carries a certain kind of a real and partly imagined historical injury of the majority religious community in India. Therefore, communalism, I think, is at a level of the everyday practices that we have: social, cultural, political, and economic. Islamophobia, on the other hand, I think is a completely different phenomena that requires some sense of not knowing the other, of treating the other as a stranger, from which that idea of, from that distance of not knowing through this process of othering, there is a kind of a hegemonic justification for xenophobic violence, visceral hatred, and an irrational kind of a fear of the Muslims. But my sense is that in the Indian context, I don't think we have that kind of a social context where a Muslim is an unknown figure or is a stranger, or the process of othering involves this kind of a visceral hatred, or more so a kind of a fear. My argument, therefore, is that there is no that kind of an irrational fear of the Muslims that, for instance, you find in in North America or in Europe. And this has to do with the social phenomena of the process of kind of modernity that Europe and North America have, process of individuation and individualism that Europe has. We have, I think, a different kind of a communitarian context. And therefore, I argue that much of the violence against the religious minorities in India, as Paul Brass argued in his book on collective violence, is very organized and socially kind of engineered kind of a violence. We rarely have instances of spontaneous or organic kind of violence breaking out. And therefore, we need to understand the the situation of the religious minorities in India through what I refer to as contextual communalism. And I argue that Islamophobia, I think, is a counterproductive narrative that secular, democratic, and progressive forces are themselves, in a sense, compelled to kind of use this bracket, simplified term for very many different complex social phenomena that are existing on the ground. So we need to avoid this Islamophobia, and that's the argument I'm going to make as to why we need to make this distinction between communalism and Islamophobia. I think is a very important distinction to my mind in the Indian context. For instance, as I said, communalism in India emerges from a sense of a memory and historical injury. If you look at, for instance, the complex history of two-nation theory that resulted in partition in 47 in India, and then we had, for instance, if you take Telangana, we had the rule of Nizam, which involved violence perpetrated by their private militia, the Razakars. Now, I don't think it would be a fair thing to say that critique of Nizam's rule or critique of triggering or opening up a debate on the nature of violence by the Razakars is Islamophobia. I think much secular progressive historians often, I think, we tend to sort of blanket and flatten out this. Uh, I think Nizam's rule, if you look at the history of Telangana, was fairly oppressive. But what is distinct is that when the right wing forces currently when they're mobilizing in Telangana use this history of Razakats, violence by Razakats, but they offer us a very selective rendering of history. They forget that that Nizam was in alliance with the Hindu, mostly the Reddy community, caste-based landlords, and it was also a movement against the communist insurgency that was present then. And therefore, what right does is that it offers a selective rendering, kind of a distorted causation. And to counter this, one cannot simply also avoid historical complexities and instead displace it through this kind of an abstract blanket and a very vague term called Islamophobia. So when history is being distorted, the real challenge, I think, is to think through that historical complexity. That there are so many variations that exist in history. That there were Razakats, there was a real-term violence against Hindus by Razakats, but that violence was not merely out of a religious kind of an hatred, but it involved a class question, it involved the simultaneous communist insurgency, as I said, Reddy landlords were in connivance with the Razakats. The real challenge for the secular progressive forces is to think through how to make this historical complexity, how to translate this historical complexity into popular, in popular politics and into some kind of a popular imagination. Therefore, people understand that there was a history or historical context to that violence, rather than deny that violence or merely brand talking of that politics as Islamophobia. The reason why I say that there is no Islamophobia in the Indian context is that even if you take a simple survey, I've done a couple of surveys around this, that even the worst bigot in India does not, kind of is never abusive of prophet or of Islam as a religion. I think the most Hindus would agree that all religions are legitimate modes of faith, are legitimate routes to spirituality. There is no, as I said, random hatred of Muslims that you will find, which is what is being constructed gradually. But as yet, I would still stick out my neck and argue that there is no random hatred against the Muslims. And I think Delhi riots, I'm told Dr. Indu was involved. Perhaps it would be good to take off this point that even Delhi riots were a kind of social engineered riot rather than a spontaneous thing that was born out of visceral hatred for Muslims. It is very contextual, this kind of a violence that is through concerted efforts by spreading rumors and misinformation on WhatsApp and other social media. Is how gradually these riots and a lot of outsiders generally are involved in these kinds of violent eruptions, rather than that being erupting spontaneously in an organic sense. Similarly, if you look at even at the height of the campaign of Ghar Wapsi and Love Jihad, I argue that India has what I refer to as an oscillating public sphere. That there is a certain amount of consent that moves into these kinds of forms of mobilization of Love Jihad, Ghar Wapsi, and things like that. But you will also see simultaneously approval of popular Bollywood flicks like Bajrangi Bhaijaan and PK becoming such massive hits right at the time when we were witnessing this kind of a huge communal polarized discourse emerging. So I think we have an oscillating public sphere that can congeal and become quite polarized in certain contexts, but then it can also swing back into a more open-ended kind of a composite. So why, how does this happen? I think it's a very complex historical question, which I will not be able to take it up here. But what I would argue is therefore that I think we need to take this phenomena of it being porous, this communalism being porous and contextual rather than congealed. And my point is that the right-wing forces the Sangh Parivar forces are precisely attempting, the challenge for them is that this communalism does not get congealed. It is not frozen. It swings. What they're doing is actually to build Islamophobia in India, that to build a kind of a random, a visceral, irrational hatred of everything that has to do with Muslims. And therefore, and that is where they are failing again and again, that there are moments that discourse seems to appeal and there is a kind of a hysteria that generates, but there are moments that it does not simply appeal. So I think Delhi was a clear example that after Delhi riots, Delhi election results is a clear example of this, that no amount of building of that hysteria through Goli Maro and all kinds of discourse. I mean, I was in Delhi, it was suffocating during that 1 week, 10 days preceding the election. It was like we were being bombarded, and I was traveling and talking in public transport to auto drivers, and they were so clear that it was so clear that discourse was simply not impacting people, and they're very clear that which way they would be voting, and so on and so forth. But there are contexts in which they might buy this discourse. So I think we need to keep open, and that's why I prefer to call it contextual communalism. And had we had Islamophobia, I think Islamophobia requires a kind of a hysteria. I think what is unique when compared to, even if you look at the German history, is that in Germany, Nazis partly succeeded because they could build a kind of hysteria. And in India, the right-wing forces are precisely failing to build a hysteria. That we do not have a hysteria against Muslims, and therefore they're trying to build this kind of a discourse of Islamophobia. Secular, progressive, democratic forces, I think, are indulging in a certain kind of a counterproductive narrative by already conceding that there is Islamophobia, by already conceding that everything that happens on the ground in relation to Muslims, any kind of a public debate is Islamophobia. In fact, when I wrote these couple of pieces are making this point in the Wire and other news portals on some TV channels, some of my Muslim colleagues told me this is also Islamophobia. The fact that you're denying Islamophobia is also Islamophobia. So this kind of a blanket expansion of a term to which I think is quite counterproductive. My third point would be, I think we'll have to also look at this growing polarization in the context of economy. I think Islamophobia kind of a culturalized narrative displaces the place of economy. I think neoliberal post 1990s, I think the rise of cultural majoritarianism post 1990s. I mean, these right-wing forces existed, have a history of 100 years, but they could never capture a popular imagination the way they have succeeded now to a large extent. Began to happen post 1990s, post neoliberal reforms. I think that connect between cultural majoritarianism and neoliberalism is a very, very important connect. That neoliberalism also produces, needs a certain kind of a surplus population that needs to be displaced and dispossessed, what we otherwise refer to as a primitive accumulation, or in the urban sector, the disorganized informal labor. I think these are very important. In some of my surveys in Telangana, for instance, in Mahbubnagar district, post 2000, which is very silent and people have not noticed this, is that the right-wing forces have made a concerted mobilization where Muslim sellers uh, sell their products, like the retail shops they have, only to Muslim customers. The Hindu customers do not go there. Even they told me that their supply of the product happens only from the Muslim contractors, that no Hindu contractor sells to them. So there has been a literal economic ghettoization of Muslims, which in course of time then triggers, and we start noticing it when there is organized big time violence that happens. But there are these insidious economic processes that keep happening much before for why that violence fructifies into that kind of an hatred. And this Islamophobia kind of discourse simply allows us no space to enter into this real-time economic, why certain petty producers among Hindus would be interested in a certain kind of violence against Muslims. I think is deeply rooted in economy. Studies of Gujarat also clearly show. Jan Bremen's studies in Ahmedabad, the textile mills, and how he argued that the communal violence happened wherever textile mills were closed down. That old collapse of trade union movement was, he in fact argues, is directly linked to the nature of violence against Muslims. So this cannot be captured simply by referring to two. There are further more complex issues. For instance, in Uttar Pradesh, in some pockets, Muslims are landed. They are the landed community where, like any other landed community, they indulge in economic exploitation against mostly against Dalit labor, including the instances I'm told of sexual violence against Dalit women. So this is again, I think, a very complex phenomenon. How do you this overlap between religion and class exploitation, which happens in small pockets. And I think in Uttar Pradesh, in these pockets, part of the mobilization against Muslims or part of the shift of the Dalit Bahujan communities towards right is happening because of their economic and social positioning. Because Muslims also practice caste-based kind of Hindu caste-based kind of discrimination. Similarly, the recent phenomenon of lynching that we watched is also because of this, what some have referred to as the cow economy, that the lynchings are linked to the nature of displacing Muslims from some of these trade that is involved within with the cow economy. And this is where I think we need to, therefore, if you look at this kind of history, I think we need to recognize that Islamophobia as a conceptual in North America, which has a very distinct history, which, as I said, has a distinct notion of modernity. It moved from secularism to multiculturalism. What multiculturalism did to much of Europe, which they have themselves later recognized and sort of partly rejected as a viable social policy, is that it brought a certain kind of a legitimized social ghettoization between communities. I remember when I was in Denmark, a friend took me out for a walk, and he showed me how colonies existed distinctly. That you had a South Asian, you had a Bangladeshi colony, you had a white colony, you had a Muslim colony. Each one of them, they're socially, they were completely segregated and separated. And the interesting part was that they never thought there is anything wrong with that. That was a legitimate multiculturalism where everyone exists in their own space. So there is, in the end, less conflict that happens, which is what the political philosopher Zizek refers to as difference as distance. That is, you experience this difference through distance, through literally social distancing that happens between communities. He wrote, and he said, this has something to do, in his very famous piece, which he wrote, Multiculturalism or the Logic of Multinationals. A very interesting piece that he did in New Left Review. He makes this very interesting point that multiculturalism, its social logic, has something to do with multinational global capital and financial capital, of how the social ghettoization also has economic overtones and economic emphasis. In Indian context, I'm trying to argue that we never had a policy of multiculturalism. We never had a very legitimate idea of, I think Indian history of secularism is very, very different. We were trying to not, we did not even agree to secularism as a separation of religion and politics, or religion and the state. We have had, I think, a very selective intervention of state, being a post-colonial democracy. We wanted to secularize social spaces, yet provide legitimacy to religious identity. I think Indian secularism is not anti-religious. It is anti-communalism and anti-majoritarian, but it is not anti-religious. In course of handling this complexity, of course, secularism did many things of allowing Muslims to continue with their personal laws, intervening with, beginning with Hindu Code Bill into Hindu religious practices. Whether that is right or wrong, was that the best way to go about? Was there a kind of a trade-off between social rights and cultural identity of the Muslims in the Constituent Assembly? These are all, I think, very legitimate and very complex debates in the Indian context. But this is not the kind of multiculturalism that Europe experienced. I think our secularism is a very, I think, acknowledged a very lived diversity, and I think it acknowledges religion as an everyday social practice, that religion has social ethics, and therefore I think we never had that kind of a rigid segregation between Hindus and Muslims. Even today, when I go back to my village in Telangana, very close to Hyderabad, I see that Hindus and Muslims live very close together. They're in the know of their family affairs. There's an economic interdependence that happens in agriculture and in the non-farm sector. And also in Indian context, therefore, because of this community presence of Muslims, I think they were linked very closely to democratic process and to democratic political participation. Even Mr. Modi, in one of his interviews, said that we have no homegrown insurgency of Muslims in India. And that's partly because a lot of they are invested in democracy and political participation. And therefore, democracy also brings Muslims in close interaction, in a continuous public gaze on Muslim politics and what they are doing and Muslim cultural practices. So that's the reason why we do not have that kind of a ghettoized imagination of Muslim as an unknown figure. I think for Islamophobia and for irrational fear to exist, you need to have the other as someone who is completely unknown. And therefore, he exists only in a certain imaginary domain, which is what the right-wing forces, of course, are attempting to do through social media, through distortion of history, by this demographic anxiety they create of they multiplying faster. All this is to create Islamophobia. But it is to create, it is to construct Islamophobia. And that once they have constructed, I think the right-wing forces seem to assume that once it's constructed, then the nature of violence against Muslims will become more spontaneous. Then it becomes more organic. Then it becomes without control, without it being necessarily engineered, that it would erupt in its everyday form. So we are, I think, making a category mistake of what is being attempted to construct. We are already conceding by saying that there is rampant Islamophobia in India. And I think you have already conceded a lot of social space to the right. And for right, I think is my own hunch is that right is very comfortable in arguing that there is Islamophobia in India, because you have already conceded what they actually wish to build. In fact, when I wrote this piece in Wire, of course, there were some critical interventions, but one of the RSS, I think they do this weekly, I forget the name, and they released a video. They did a half-an-hour video on my article and said that here is a person from JNU who is saying that there is no Islamophobia. So he was actually angry that I was saying that there is no Islamophobia. So I think we need to really read between the lines to see why right would be unhappy if we say that there is no Islamophobia, and they would want us to convince that we need to make this category mistake and already concede and say that there is Islamophobia that exists in India. That takes me to the question of why I think Muslim politics also is caught within this kind of a blanket, easy kind of a very simplified framing of Islamophobia. Apart from secular liberal forces, I think Muslim politics also takes this easy route of flattening out is because of, I think, the internal complexities that exist within Muslims. I think this idea of our inability to deal with historical complexities, the fact that there was real-time violence between these two communities from both ends. It was not just Hindus, but it was violence, and both communities suffered. I think partition continues to be a living memory. So the first point would be that even Muslims politics does not actually know how to deal with this. The second important point, I think, is that we do not really have a handle on making a distinction between cultural differences and prejudice. That is all cultural difference linked to prejudice. I think even I am thinking through this problem, I do not have clarity that it looks at certain points, as some political theorists have argued, that all difference can be necessarily constructed only by othering, by a certain kind of a closure, and therefore prejudice continues to play a role. So we really also, I think, in the Indian context, since cultural difference is so lived, so diversity is so everyday form, it's a lived form, that we do not know how to negotiate these prejudices. For instance, in food habits, the differences that exist. So you can have certain communities being vegetarian, certain communities not. That is this a difference or a prejudice? This, I think, is in its everyday forms. We really do not know how to handle them. Therefore, in every Muslim majority spaces like Aligarh, that you have Ramzan and everything closes down. Now, is this a kind of a majority legitimate or illegitimate? We do not know whether that's a cultural difference, whether it's an imposition of one religion on another. So I think on everyday, the way cultural difference plays out in its everyday, very concrete micro spaces, we do not know where to draw the line between cultural difference and prejudice. Cultural difference can easily spill over in popular politics, in popular imagination that this is prejudice of one community. Well, and the concrete can be very kind of a very flat, lateral kind of a difference. So I think we have really failed to make this distinction between these two. Uh, Similarly, I think, as I said, that then takes me to this question at the third level, that Muslim politics is also built on a certain homogenized understanding of Muslim identity, which I think again does not exist on the ground. That there is no single category like the Muslim existing. You have you have caste differences, you have regional and spatial differences that are very strong. And for instance, the Pasmanda question that is coming up again and again in Indian, the Shia Sunni distinction that is coming up again and again. I think for even for the Muslim politics, therefore, using Islamophobia becomes really a shorthand to sort of maintain the cohesiveness within the Muslim identity, as I argued, doesn't really exist. In fact, the right-wing political parties, especially the RSS, is extremely aware of these internal differences, which is what they're trying to do in Kashmir by wooing the Shias over the Sunnis. They are the first one, which is ironic in the Indian context, in their Goa convention, I think, or Karnataka convention. They were the first one to raise the demand of reservations for Pasmanda Muslims. So they are trying to now play on these internal differences within the Muslims. Neither the secular democratic forces nor the Muslim politics led by somebody like OIC, I think, are willing to sort of dip in and really negotiate as to how do we place these real-time economic and social differences that exist within the Muslims, the prejudice that really exists, rampant prejudice. And one has to only visit Kashmir Valley to see how there is so much of rampant prejudice of Valley Sunni Muslims against those from Ladakh, Shias from Ladakh, against Poonch Muslims from border areas, the rural, urban Muslims against rural. So there are all kinds of internal prejudices that flow. And therefore, the Islamophobia then becomes this kind of a shorthand to maintain a kind of an internal cohesion that really does not exist. And therefore, the limit of the Islamophobia kind of an identity discourse is the OIC kind of politics. That I do not think that OIC would, while Muslims would argue that he is at least articulating a certain kind of a minority politics, but I would argue that that kind of a politics that Mr. OIC represents, I think, is a very counterproductive kind of a regressive minority politics. I've had a chance to closely watch OIC's politics in Telangana and Hyderabad. He completely banks on displacing the social question of Muslims' access to education, economic expansion of economic opportunities, and singularly focuses on this question of religious identity and cultural threat, which is the kind of narrative that the right also requires. So there is a kind of a jugalbandi that keeps happening between the OIC brand of Islamophobia politics and the brand of RSS, wish to construct that kind of an Islamophobic majoritarian politics in India. So it is at this context I would turn and argue that the way forward really is, as I said, we should move back to contextual communalism as a discourse in the Indian public sphere, recognize that we have an oscillating public sphere in the Indian context, then recognize and then work on how this complex history that these two communities have had in India, going back to even pre-colonial rule, and how to make that complexity part of popular memory and popular imagination. But what is that secular? And people have made these attempts. For instance, Akbar as a symbol of secular Muslim, so on and so forth. I think we need more attempts of that kind. But also, we will have to face those instances where there has been a real-time violence of even Muslims against Hindus. How do we deal with that violence? I think we need a certain kind of a discourse to counter this sense of historical injury that is being built. I think secular, democratic, especially left forces in India, completely deny the sense of historical injury of Hindus, this sense of anxiety, demographic, or sense of cultural anxiety that it might create. I don't think that kind of a blanket denial I think is useful. It in fact provides the social space necessary for majoritarian politics. And whenever I refer to this, now of course my friends caution me that this might also open space for more Islamophobia, more legitimate violence against Muslims. That is a real challenge. I do see that point. But for that, I think putting a blanket, pushing it under the carpet, I think does not help. We need some kind of opening of dialogue, the way South Africa did some kind of a truth commission of reconciliation, opening up of to stare back at our own history of a partition and then a post-partition history, real-time cultural differences between these communities, and convert it into. And I think at this context, this therefore requires internal. I think I see a link. I'll come to that. I'll explain that link. And therefore, I'm trying to argue. I'm trying to therefore at this context raise the question that for secularism to succeed in the Indian context, uh, I think opening up the questions of power, discrimination, and prejudice internal to communities after this kind of a authoritarian populist mobilization of the right wing becomes some kind of a necessary condition. I see a link between the social conditions internal to these subaltern communities and this kind of a secular progressive discourse. I think we do not have that privilege any longer to put a lid on these internal questions and then have a secular ethos. That is where I see that gender, I think, becomes the most key category, along with caste, which is much less perhaps pertinent in the context of Muslim politics. And I think opening up of the gender question, the way we have seen Shaheen Bagh, women coming onto streets, the question of women's autonomy within the Muslim community, I think raises the question of justice at a different level. That you can no longer minority communities, or for that matter, even this question remains relevant for Dalit Bahujan communities. How do we frame internal discriminatory prejudices practices between subcastes within Dalits, between subcastes within the OBCs, between the OBCs and Dalits? This is what in my recent book, which I've edited, I refer to as secular sectarianism. That there is a sectarian logic internal to the subaltern castes. That they have also, that we have failed to open up these and you can see that how right-wing political mobilization today in Uttar Pradesh and Bihar are actually expanding by mobilizing the underrepresented subaltern castes within the OBCs and within the Dalits. The fact that our kind of a secular Bahujan discourse failed to open up that space, that there is internal discrimination, that internally Dalits and this kind of affirmative action and political representation has failed to provide some kind of a level playing field for smaller Dalits and smaller subcastes within the OBCs, what has given a massive entry point. So this old argument that secular political scientists, sociologists argued that OBC reservation is some kind of a second democratic upsurge, is a secular upsurge, and caste is a kind of a check on confessional politics. That because of caste divisions internal to Hinduism, that in itself guarantees a certain kind of a secular upsurge, because it does not allow for cultural majoritarianism and Hindu identity to consolidate. I think today has fallen flat. Today we clearly see that more internal fragmentation, more recognition of internal identities is leading to more cultural majoritarianism. So this kind of holding on to this larger rubrics of Dalit and OBC that secular politics did, that's the reason I call it as secular sectarianism. That the sectarian logic within secular groups in their political functioning, the way secularism, I think, in its workings, not in its spirit, but in its working translated on the ground, has provided a huge space for right-wing cultural mobilization. I think they're able to also morally, on ethical front, question the legitimacy of this whole language of justice that progressive left forces use. That on one hand you are demanding for equality, but on another hand you do not want to yourself practice that equality internal to your own communities. So you would want to be equal to the Hindu counterpart, but the question of gender and caste internal to Muslims becomes an internal question. Dalits and Bahujans would want equality and equal share vis-a-vis the dominant caste, but the discrimination internal to them remains something internal that no other caste cannot intervene in. This, I think, was the social basis for secular discourse, which to my mind, I think the right-wing groups have managed to, right or wrong, gain a foothold. And I think that old kind of a secular discourse has collapsed. So I therefore also have argued in my book on India after Modi that this kind of an authoritarian right-wing populism actually might present us to deepen democracy in the Indian context. That in a default way, as an unwilling kind of a byproduct could be that it is opening up new spaces for a different kind of political discourse and a different kind of beyond majority minority secular communal kind of a discourse, that we are now forced to stare at issues that we are not very comfortable with, issues that we do not have ready political categories and political theorization. And I think the first entry point for that is the gender question. I think gender question within the Muslims brings in a very important way that constitutional, when you take recourse to constitution, people can legitimately ask you that you cannot have take recourse to constitutional provisions and constitutional morality in a selective way. That you cannot argue for secularism and constitutional morality vis-a-vis a dominant community, but refrain from allowing that constitutional principles and constitutional ethos when it comes to internal matters of the community. I think that old way of preserving cultural identity with this gender question might change, and I welcome it. I think it's an important way that we should be opening up of internal power dynamics across all religions and all caste groups. I think that, in a sense, will give us a way out of this language of secular sectarianism. The fact that these groups were individually ghettoized, and this logic of justice got ghettoized, I think, is breaking down. And that, I think, provides us for a new context of discussing about what is the alternate modes of solidarity between Dalits, Muslims, and OBCs. I think for the first time is opening up in a real sense. That unless we do not sort of galvanize and address these questions of internal prejudice, internal limitations within these communities and their self-representation, this language of secular unity that was offered without questioning power internally, I think for the first time in a very meaningful way, in an unwitting way, the Hindutva kind of politics is opening up for us. And that, I think, to my mind, will be the good takeaway from this authoritarianism that we have been putting, especially coming from you, perhaps empathize with the kind of continuous breathing down that we have been facing in JNU. And therefore, I would conclude by arguing that I think the gender politics might open up different modes of framing common issues of women across castes and across religious groups. Once this question becomes foregrounded, a question of maybe domestic violence, economic opportunities, social prejudices, control, Uma Chakravarti argues that after all in the context was also essentially about control of property and women's sexuality. So this kind of sectionality that existed between these various identities, I think now with gender, I think in that sense becomes an important mode. And one of the reasons I feel, I would conclude by arguing that the Muslim, that sexuality, the question of sexuality, I think is at the center of this mobilization against Muslims. French Enlightenment theorist, philosopher Voltaire once very interestingly said, "You cannot hate something that you do not love passionately." We only hate things that we actually love passionately somewhere in our subconscious we adore. I think something of that kind is on with the question of Muslims, framing of the Muslim identity, even in the Indian context and partly globally because of liquid modernity and community anxiety growing. I mean, I don't have the time to get into the details, but I think there is this question of sexuality, gender control that leads to a certain kind of an envy of the Muslim that is being constructed. As I said, I don't have the time. There's a complex argument I make, but I will leave that for a moment. But then argue that sexual control of sexuality and the gender question, and in general the internal power equation, once we begin to open it up, as it happened in Shaheen Bagh, though there were only old women mostly sitting there, but I wish there are more young women who come onto streets, Muslim women. I think that will change the equation. That will, I think, this question that once the gender becomes, I think a large number of internal questions will begin. This whole myth of singular Muslim identity will begin to crack up, of Dalit, and I think which is a welcome thing in a way, and that will open up for framing questions of justice in very different way from this majority minority kind of thing. That will also open up a real-time space for perhaps alliance between the Dalits, Muslims, and OBCs that we were looking for, and therefore I think we'll find a way beyond secular sectarianism. But to get there, I think my attempt today has been that we begin with a certain kind of a critique of this kind of a blanket use of Islamophobia as a discourse. I think, Professor Indu, I'll stop here so that we have some time because Arjun said half an hour is my upper limit. So I'll stop here, and thanks to all of you for this patient hearing.
Well, in fact, thanks a lot, Dr. Ajay, for a very interesting presentation. And I think you surely brought in the difference between contextual communalism and Islamophobia. And you mentioned as to how Islamophobia has got more to do with North American and European perspectives of looking at Muslims and, I think their own cultural moorings and all. And how in India, I think the context is more of, contextual communalism as such, which is which is social, political, and economic as such in nature. And I think I agree to that. And I think most of us will agree to that. And I think you surely bring about this thing about how, most of this communalism has been socially engineered, rights. And like you spoke about Delhi, and, I must share that because I think we were involved in the relief during the post riots in Delhi, and so we with lots of volunteer organizations all moved around in Mustafabad and these areas, Northeast district as such. And everybody was saying, that how there were outsiders who came and attacked, the Muslims, and that they had never seen, whether it's Shiv Vihar, whether, the various crossings and all that we had been to, everywhere, I think it was the same thing was there, that outsiders who attacked. And, also somewhere if you see, I think the way the union government also handled it with various reports and all, I think, keeping Kapil Mishra out of it, when he's publicly declaring and challenging. And today, in fact, there are reports against everybody else, against Yugendra Yadav, against Harsh Mandar and all that. And Kapil Mishra, not a finger being pointing towards him. So how with the police and how, like I remember those days, Ajay, you were also in Delhi that time. We started a WhatsApp group at that point, and I must tell you, I used to get messages around 1 o'clock in the night that people are congregating this point and trying to attack the Muslim, groups. And for the next, after the riots also, which was from about 24th to 26th of February, after what happened, when Modi was there in Gujarat, it was a very well timed stuff, very well programmed stuff. It was a fully programmed, engineered thing, which you all understand. How they use that to actually, divert the attention to, there'll be no media talking about it because everybody's talking about, Trump there. So I think they use all that. And I think we saw as to how the entire state machinery was used. That time the elections were just fresh and this party had come to power. So they wanted to discredit the party. So I think it was lots of things going on, that if they can impose president's rule there, if they can use, nullify the elections or whatever. I think there were a whole lot of things happening. So you can understand, and so for us, because we were involved in the post-riot relief, I think we had lots of candid observations from both the women, the children, and the men. So we were at the Idgah Relief Center also, where we engaged, and there were groups that were working there. We have had friends working there as such. So we know as to how this was engineered by the party in power, and by BJP itself, very clear. No point in missing words here. And so we were able to stall some of the riots which were going to take place in the night, because we called up the Joint Commissioner of the Police. There was this person called Alok Kumar, who was Joint Commissioner of Police, North District. And fortunately, I met him on one occasion. And every time I used to message, say, please communicate this to other police officials. And that actually worked, where we were up at 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. and all that, sending a this is message we're getting, please stop it. Otherwise, you all will be held responsible. And so we know as to how things were happening, how rumors were being spread. We were getting calls from Jahangir Puri and other areas of Delhi, Tilak Nagar and all, how this rumor is coming up, that Muslims are, the Hindus are gathering to attack Muslims and all that, So I think what I talk about, contextual communalism vis-a-vis, Islamophobia, I think the entire game, as you mentioned clearly in your presentation, was to actually, create the wedge between the Hindus and Muslims, create a fear, amongst the Muslims that the entire Hindu community is against them. So I think this, fortunately, I think through what's happened in the past many, many years, I think surely, we've had great secular moorings in the country, despite the fact that the right wants to create a wedge in our society. I think, we are still, I would say, secular, in many of these things. And I would also bring in here, that I think for many of us, who are also from JNU, and also I did my one master's in Jamia. This year in Jamia, we have 100 years of Jamia, okay, which emerged to the nationalist movement. And I was there in Jamia about 2 weeks back, celebrating 100 years world over. And, there's a lot of camaraderie, the friendship that we have with each other. So, and even today, there is no such thing, that there is any wedge between us and them. We are all together. And one point which you bring in here, I think which is very, very important is that, like we have, had friends like Ram Punyani, who has so beautifully talked about as to how even, like these Hindutva forces try to pitch Rana Pratap versus Akbar. And Ram Punyani makes it very clear that actually Rana Pratap had a Muslim general and Akbar had a Hindu general. So it was not, a war between two communities. It was a war for their own dominion status, right? So don't redraw history, don't recreate history which is not there, So similarly, I think you mentioned this thing about Shaheen Bagh. Lots of women have come out. And I want to also bring this fact here, which I think is important for us to also discuss as we go by, that because I've been to Shaheen Bagh, I've been to mobilizations in Nizamuddin, in Jama Masjid, and I must tell you, I saw a large number of young women, young girls speaking out. We had Jannat Farooqi in Jama Masjid stairs speaking against CAA and NRC. Young girl in all her 20s. And what a formidable clarity she had, and we were there to support her. So I think there were a large number of young girls which emerged from the Muslim community. I think the most important thing is that, and that I would say is the cultural resurgence of the country. What
Hmm.
Modi and Amit Shah didn't realize that by getting the CA and RC, they got all of us mobilized. So when you talk about India against Modi, when you're saying that it's going to deepen democracy, I ditto that, because we all got together and maybe our solidarities got together much deeper. And maybe that is the real promise, that we all see as to where the right elements are trying to create Islamophobia by all those lynchings and, beti, kya? Bahu lao, beti
Love
bachao,
jihad.
love jihad
Yeah.
concept that they have. And, I think, so all those things, I think, is very important that even the Muslim community and the Hindu community, they are aware of it. The only thing is they are trying their best to create the wedge. And I think, your issues about, that in fact, there is a secular sectarianism, and that how the subaltern caste actually, how it has been, there's been a wedge between that, and how this is something which we need to grapple with. I think is an important point. I agree with that. I think, and somewhere, I think we also fall prey to what you were saying in terms of, culture, communalism versus Islamophobia. We also try to get this in the, oh my God, this is what is happening. But the truth, as you said rightly, is that actually it is not a question of Islamophobia. It's like many communalisms that they're trying to create in the country. It is a ploy, it's very much engineered. It is not spontaneous. I totally agree with you. So thanks for this very, very interesting presentation, Dr. Ajay. And I would now request, other friends here, whether it's Simi or Arjun and other participants, to just contribute to this. Any questions you have, just add to that.
Sir,
Over to you.
Sir, we have Professor Govind Kilkar.
Yeah, Govindji, please. Yes.
Govind ma'am.
Govindji also. Yeah. Govindji, over to you for your views.
Okay.
Ma'am, your video.
Okay, all right. Now, Dr. Ajay, I agree with most part of it. I really do agree, and I have a hope, and I thank you and Indu Prakashji for giving some hope. Hope is the way of life. That there would be a rise of surge of democratic forces. I've been feeling very hopeless. That is the kind of thing. I think when these forces, these leaders come up, they come up because there is a widespread Malay in our society. That is the kind of thing that I've been feeling like this. So, hate is created by majoritarianism. And this majoritarianism is not only confined to these two putlas. It is much more that kind of thing. So that would be the one thing. I agree that there is economic ghettoization of Muslims. That is true. And that shows the kind of general lack of bit of backwardness in terms of not letting women out, I would think, and compared to other societies. So that is also, I see that. But and I have also witnessed social ghettoization, Pakistani area, this and that kind of even in Scandinavia, which I kind of Oslo and other places, which I thought that very democratic centers that was there. Where I have some point when I said I mostly agree with this, that I missed you in the first 10 minutes or so. I was in another Delhi University seminar where I had to speak. That mostly seemed to be the economic factor. That this was the kind of economic factor. This is true that Muslims are economically poor, but we have not or never addressed cultural identities. That is also kind of not during this time, not earlier also. Some ad hoc attempts were made, but not really addressed. That was the kind of thing that has come. So when we talk of RSS or the like politics, it is not only economic factor; it is social, cultural factors also. You cannot really say that sati, burning of the women on the pyre, or witch hunts. I published a book on witch hunts. These were the kind of practices because of economic factors. Of course, women don't inherit anything, that is true, and our land question is also there. But their land question is also they are responsible for the witch hunts. but it is not really because of the economic factors. Because even when a person like Birsa Munda, he fought against the British colonialist, the song was kill, oh father, kill these witches and cleanse the forest so that they are purified. So that is what probably then that one thing that need to kind of be addressed. That prejudices have social and cultural roots in addition to economic roots. That would be also have to be see that we are very caste stratified society. So that is the, I mean, there are not only atrocities against Muslims, there are or atrocities against women, there are atrocities so much against Dalits and the treatment of Dalits. And that becomes the basis, besides being their poor status, there is the caste kind of purity and pollution that goes on. So we need to build a approach of powering or empowering society, empowering of subaltern, starting with women. You talked of Shaheen Bagh. I also have been to Shaheen Bagh number of times. And it was not only, as Indu Prakash ji said, that it was not only old women, although one Dadi got very kind of in
Yes.
prominence. She was very, it were many young women who were singing
Yes.
very kind of interesting songs. And what was most impressive, they kept the crowd in control. They did
Yes.
not want anybody to come and any political party to come and take over the things. I was very impressed with this, that it was their movement and they wanted to keep control of this. This fact most impressed me besides their coming together. But I was also, I've seen that kind of, and I was, why I'm talking of the subaltern, because earlier I have seen Shaheen Bagh, Shahbano case. But Shahbano's case for justice that she wanted was not really supported by left. And I had a debate at that time with the left very strongly, kind of thing, that how this is a struggle for justice, it's maybe any kind of thing. But it was a political strategy on their part and they did not support that. So later it was learning on this part. I could not agree more with you on this final point that you said, the really gender, I call it feminist. Feminism is the way that will show, of course, the social democratic path to us, because they are oppressed in both Hindu and Muslim and other societies, Christian societies, and their sexuality, their body, their labor, everything is controlled, and they are physically eliminated. Control, not only simple control, but most brutal kind of form of control. And this kind of liberation of women is going to lead some kind of democratic unleash, because it is so brutal that even on the question of religion or culture, you cannot really support it. You cannot really say this is part of our culture. So that is the force that is going to take place. But I like your hope. I'm look forward to reading your book, that gender is going to show that, or the women's liberation, I would call it, going to lead the liberation of the general society from these forces that are emerged. Thank you, Ajay, or Professor Ajay. Gudavarthi, how do you pronounce your last name? Gudavarthi.
Yes, Godavarthi, absolutely.
Okay, thank you. Pleasure. It was very nice meeting you. Thank you.
Simi, would you like to go on?
Yes. You, Dr. Ajay Gudavarthi, Dr. Indu, and Professor Govind Kelkar for wonderful presentation, sir. And also, ma'am and sir have put their point of views so clearly. And it is, of course, a very passionate subject. And sir, I just have one submission to make. It is rather a supplement to your presentation. Whether there is Islamophobia or not, or whether there is phobia against any religion in India or any other part of the world, when the theory and practice of politics supporting religion comes to the forefront, we will see a domination of one or the other religion over the other. The entire syncretic and the Shramanic tradition of Indian political thought you so wonderfully teach. It actually exhorts, both the traditions have exhorted the disassociation of statecraft from religion. And the reasons and the causes are obvious, that why religion should be separated from politics. So if religion is relegated to our individual spaces, then certainly the state would then mind its business of its primary functions, which is to take care of the people, the comprehensive development of the people, and all other various facets of development which we are trying to aim at. So perhaps one of the reasons why we are still a part of the global south is that we have not really focused enough to separate state from religion. This is my understanding. I would really want to be corrected if Dr. Ajay Gudavarti would like to. Thank you so much.
Sir, we have a young colleague also. We have Lean, she's a young journalist, and also we have Punya. Punya studies gender at TIS, masters at TIS. So, Lean, would you like to go first?
Yes, I'm
Yes.
not a young journalist. I'm going to correct you there. I have
Okay.
trained in journalism, and I practice independent media. And I think my response to what Dr. Ajay Gudavarti shared is sort of multifold. I disagree with many of your submissions, while I agree with a few of them. For instance, I agree with you when you talk about economic ghettoization of people who are Muslim, and there is obviously an organized nature in which this is done. There is an organized process. I would not say it is only by people in politics. I would say it needs obviously people who are on the ground. It needs civil society's participation for that to happen. So for instance, in Gujarat, you will see that, women who were in upper caste homes and locations were pushed out of their homes post the genocide of 2002, and economically their standing comes down. They are not able to return to their old homes once the instance of violence is over as well. So there is definitely an economic aspect to this exclusion. A lot of people have written about it, like Ramchandra Guha, and a lot of people, I mean, historically have written about this economic exclusion. But I would not say that it is as simplistic as, that it is only non-Islamophobic. I would not call it only contextual violence. I mean, yes, the violence is contextual because the context is, there is a historical context to it. But I wouldn't say that it is non-Islamophobic. That's, I think, number one that I wanted to say. You also spoke about Muslim identity not being a monolith. So there are, for instance, there is prejudice and discrimination within the Muslim community as well, towards SC/ST Muslims, towards Dalit Muslims, towards women within the Muslim community. That is also something that we cannot deny. At the same time, I think as a woman also, and locating myself as a minority woman, I would say that when we talk about, for instance, violence towards women, when we talk about rape and other forms of violence, if suddenly, somebody tells me when I go to make a complaint of sexual violence that, पर तुम भी अपने भाई से झगड़ा करती हो, पर तुम भी कपड़े ऐसे पहनती हो, तुम भी ऐसे, तुम्हारे में भी कुछ होगा. So I would say that when Muslim persons are being persecuted and being marginalized, singularly for the identity of being Muslim, when you start speaking about the fact that Muslims are not a monolith, what it does is it sort of puts the onus back on the victim. And that's not something that I would say is desirable. I also think it points towards another kind of prejudice, which is a patriarchal prejudice as well, where, always the victim is blamed. Like, I think Dr. Indu was also talking about, how people who were victims, cases were filed against them. So people who are practicing a certain kind of hate politics, when they are in positions of political power, then they will also use it in that way that victims, cases are filed against the victims, right?
Thank
So
you.
I
Thank
think,
you, Lynn. Yes,
yeah.
very briefly.
No,
You
one
do
second.
not have to be, yes,
1 second. I'm sorry, Dr. Kumar. I'm not
but you
finished
can have
because
your video on. Yes, Lynn, but when if
I can't
yeah,
have my video on because I'm in a community space. I just want to say one more thing, which is very
yes,
important.
very
I
brief.
think, yes, in this gathering, for instance, I think it is an issue that there is no, according to my understanding, there is no person who's Muslim who's represented on this panel. And to me, that
Yes.
is a problem because, we say nothing for us without us. So it's really important to have that,
If you will
to
be brief,
hear.
then we can have
Yes,
more people
to
know.
hear people who are Muslim because they will tell you how they are being marginalized and excluded. Because it's easier for somebody who's not experienced it to say that this is, not Islamophobia. This is not another kind of fear. It's easy for us to say that. But somebody who experiences that discrimination on a daily basis understands what it is at a visceral level to be discriminated against, I think they will speak very differently. So I will stop for now and I will leave you and others to discuss and I'll come back if there's more to say.
Great, but media person need to be more brief. Punya, over
I
to you.
don't agree with you, Dr. Kumar. Media persons
There is
don't
very
need
less
to be
time.
more brief. You're probably talking about mainstream media. We are not mainstream media. So we have our own ways of communicating and we will not subscribe to the mainstream ways of, word
Okay,
limits.
we can leave
Okay,
this.
Sorry.
in the respect of time, Punya, very briefly.
Yes, sure.
Very brief.
Yes,
Yes.
yes, sir. So I have one, I don't know if it's a question or not, but I'm trying to understand. And also, I just wanted to put it across that globally, we seem to have a rise of hate against a certain minority community. And mostly it is done through a right wing, like if you see in what's recently been happening in France or US or anywhere around. So I just want to understand that, like as Dr. Simi said, that this is mostly done through um, a certain identification of politics. So, and I also, I don't know, I seem to have observed that there is a lot of mirroring happening um, of one place to another globally, like India or US or other places are mirroring some kind of hate against a certain minority, and in this case, Muslims. So I don't like you gave the perspective of India specifically. So if you could just briefly explain that too. And it was a really nice, insightful session. So thank you for that.
Yes, Professor Gudavarti, you don't have to answer all of them. So many questions, yes. But if you would like to, yes, reflect. We have few more, also as Lynn was highlighting, few more also Muslim women colleague also with us. Some connection issues are also coming. A few more people are also. But Indu sir, is it all right that Professor Ajay Gudavarti cover
Yeah,
up
yeah,
some of
sure.
the issues as you
Sure.
have highlighted? Yes,
Sure,
please.
sure. Yeah, there are too many questions. Please go ahead, Ajay.
Yeah, I mean, there were not really questions. I think,
Observations.
Professor Govind Kelkar, I think I agree with her that gender, I think we are on the same page. That, and we can also see this discourse emerging in Indian politics, especially electoral politics, that now women are being addressed as an independent constituency with issues like liquor prohibition in Bihar. The initial statistics show us that women have voted independently, and that has impacted the result. So I think this is a new trend which I feel would emerge in long term. I think in Indian politics as an independent constituency. Therefore, I think the way we are going to frame questions of violence, because in communal rights, women suffer the first to suffer the violence across communities, in honor killing to rape to sexual violence. So I think if we begin to frame these questions, how is it going to change our understanding of community beyond this majority minority kind of a thing? I think these are the new discourses that are waiting to break through in the public sphere in India, and therefore I feel gender will remain, as Professor Kelkar also said, I think an extremely important. Also, it breaches this public-private kind of differences. Conceptually, I feel breaching that the public-private, that women belong to the private and then the male in the public. I think once those conceptual things are broken, I think they will have very unknown kind of influences on the very nature of the public sphere, nature of violence, nature of majority minority kind of distinction. This has something to do with, they're all based somewhere between on this public private kind of distinction. To the second question by Simi, that religion, that has been the problem, that India did not go in for a clear-cut European kind of a distinction between state and religion, and I think that's a good part of Indian discourse. I don't think we are a communitarian society. Religion, Ashish Nandi makes an interesting distinction between religion as faith and religion as ideology. That what you're referring to is that kind of an ideology, instrumental use, but religion is also a much larger socio-ethical kind of a thing. And Gandhi attempted to politicize that kind of a religion as a social ethics, religion as spirituality, religion as a worldview. I don't think it's a good idea back to this idea of push back everything into the private domain, and that religion can have a role in a legitimate, but to make it happen, have to get to other questions that I try to highlight. So how do you deal with question of differences? What is the first line between difference and prejudice? There are complex questions that will come in. So we'll have to push. And I think we made a good beginning. I think India remained this kind of functional democracy, partly because we have allowed a certain legitimacy to religion, not to just am I
So your
audible?
voice is breaking. Your voice just broke for the last 30 seconds.
Yeah, but is it now clear?
Yes, now it is okay. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. So therefore we made a good beginning of the. I think religion will have some space, and I don't think we can go back to this European kind of complete separation between religion and politics. That has again different discourse on why secularism and with capitalism and modern capital, urban spaces, so on and so forth.
Again, sir, Manorama ma'am was also there. She had raised her hand. So, Indu sir, if after
Yes, surely, but
yeah.
uh,
Yes, he
I'm
has
not.
come back.
Ajay, are you
Yeah.
there?
It is breaking.
We are losing you, Ajay, time and again.
I
think there's some
Yeah,
signal
I know
issues.
it is breaking. I don't know. Suddenly,
There's some signal
connectivity
issue.
issues, I think. Is it clear now?
Also, search connection also, Shamim, Sajid,
Am I audible?
Yes, sir, you're audible.
Yeah. Am I audible now? Am I clear?
Yes, sir, you are clear, but many problem people are having this joining. Are you able to hear us?
I don't know why suddenly it is. Yeah,
Ajay,
sure.
Ajay will do one thing. We'll take some more questions, and then if you see the connection is better, you just come back. Huh? So we will just have some more people to talk, and in the meanwhile, if connection improves, I think we'll have you again. So please, Simi and Arjun, have Manorama ji and others to also intervene.
Let's go ahead.
No, Manorama ma'am is also having some difficulty. She's telling me over the phone.
Then who wants to come in now? Who wants to come in now?
Yes, sir, let me ask. Professor Gudavarti, Lynn has many questions. She will email you. I will give her or your email ID to her.
Yes, I can ask one more question if nobody else
Lynn,
is
please,
asking.
for paucity of time.
If
please,
nobody else is.
No, please, for paucity of time. For more question, please write to the expert with them. You can talk to them, directly. Is it fine, Professor Gudavarti? Yes, because many curious question also.
Yeah, yes. Arjun,
yes.
Let us speak. Let us speak.
Yes, but let me also ask few questions. Which
after you, Lynn, you can come in. Huh? After Arjun, you come in.
Yeah. Okay.
No issue. Yes. No issue. Yes. So, Dr. Gudavarti, thank you very much for your this very exciting and but the connection was pretty low bandwidth, not an issue. For highlighting so many issues, now we really know the census exercise for NPR also starting. So much of buzz has also started coming around on that aspect. And because of this issue and the sectarian issue, there has been a lot of resistance also for data and also in the service delivery, because also in policy, because there has been a lot of prejudices and a lot of things also getting determined by it. Even the whole the genuine incident also which has happened largely based on also this Islamophobia sort of thing. Indu sir was also there that night, and we really saw that JNU में जामिया के बच्चे कैसे आ गए, कौन कहाँ से आया है. If you remember, sir. In fact,
Yeah, yeah.
Yudhendra Yadav sir was also there, all the media.
Yes.
So
Yes.
this is really deep rooted, but sir, this is also a global phenomenon, not just only India. Sir, how do you see that it is very different in our subcontinent? And or is it very different in developing country or developed country? And how it has been tackled in a more democratic sort of manner. China also had the Uyghurs and other examples. All the global media is also highlighting. So this problem also persists in other nations, not just only limited to India. Sir, how do you see in the world order, or from learning from the history, what has been the way forward in tackling this kind of sectarian mindset and having really a secular going forward democratic institutions coming forward, and what can be the institutional framework for solving this sort of thing? Because for I would say 99% of Indian problem, the thing really comes is that the behavior is like that. It always comes to behavior, or that people not really getting used to it. So how do you see this arena going forward? And there has been a lot of reservation given by various state governments to the Muslim community, also to the minority community. How do you see that politics emerging, especially in this decade? UP government, in fact, has also really highlighted something of that sort there also. And we know in southern India, in most of the work where you have done in your state, Telangana and Andhra Pradesh, how do you see these things evolving? Would that really lead to empowerment or more secular or just society? And also, sir, also your view, how our secularism is different from the developed world or the first world? Your reflection for all the audience. Yes, Dr. Ajay Gudawat. Yes.
Arjun, now I think I just have Lynn to come in. Lynn, can you come in now?
Lynn,
And then we have Ajay.
Yes, I was
Yeah.
actually
Yeah.
also wanting to talk about, you mentioned at one point, Dr. Gudavarti, about constitutional morality. And you also spoke about how the right wing will be very happy, some of them at least, if we say that there is Islamophobia. In fact, some of them may not agree with you. But I also felt the right wing will be very happy with certain other assertions that you have made as well, for instance, related to constitutional morality, the fact that there are personal laws which are constitutionally provided to people who are Muslim, recognizing that they experience prejudice. I think when a certain section paints, the access to those personal laws as being unconstitutional, I think that for me is also an issue. So, there is, for instance, a counter narrative against, as women's groups will say, there is a counter narrative against the minority oppressed Muslim, which is coming through a lot of the mainstream media as well, which some may argue is, leaning a certain way, and through other discourses where the fact that a Muslim is simply accessing, the personal laws, the provisions under the personal laws, is becoming a way by which they are being called regressive. I think there needs to be an understanding that, accessing a Muslim personal law is not going against constitutional morality. Just that one point for now, I just wanted to add.
Thank you. Ajay, over to you, please.
Yeah, thanks. So in the previous round, I forgot Punya's point, I failed to note it. But anyway, I had to go in order. So Lynn's point, I still have not got the hang of her disagreements. Frankly, I'm not very clear. But except to the point that I can begin with is that experience cannot be, I think, a singular basis. I think there's a difference between experience and causation. That merely Muslims having to say that they're experiencing Islamophobia does not convince me to simply say that yes, we agree there is Islamophobia. I don't think causation, same phenomenon can have, because experience itself we access, it's not something given out there. Experience itself happens through existing categories. So because of this kind of large looming something hanging over heads that there is Islamophobia, so you begin to also experience things like that. And therefore, I feel that in Indian context, we are missing out on certain issues that might actually be blocked by this question of, by the fact that we are framing it just as Islamophobia. So that's the point. So I think there's a very fundamental difference in the way Lynn is approaching and the way I would see that. I think experience cannot be a singular category. You know, if that were true, that many women in times, as anthropologists have noted, would not experience violence, domestic violence as violence. For instance, the debate that we're having on marital rape, that many wouldn't, perhaps women, see marital rape as violence. So that does not then augment to the simple-minded conclusion that that there is no violence involved. So it's, I think, a complex issue, and experience cannot be a single marker through which we can arrive at a very definitive kind of a confirmed conclusion that Lynn seems to be taking. I didn't get her point. I did not say that personal laws constitution. I'm not clear on that point. So I think this part of it I was clear. I think where she's coming from. So
Yeah, I would say that,
that is the issue I wanted.
you mentioned that your research was based in Telangana. I would ask you to sort of, probably, if you would be interested, to expand it maybe more into Gujarat, into Maharashtra, into other parts of India perhaps, and that might change your own perspective, is my understanding of how I look at this. And I also want to say very quickly that I think the use of the word causation, I think, is also a very right-wing term. It's also the language of the perpetrator. For instance, post-genocide Gujarat 2002,
Okay, Lynn,
we
thank
did.
you. Yes. So now we have Manorma ma'am.
One second, we did hear this, that that it was a cause and effect thing, and that is not.
Yes, Manorma ma'am, over to you. Ma'am, are you able to join in?
Ma'am has mentioned her
Yes.
question.
Yes.
Sir, ma'am's Manorma ma'am, her question is, what about the reverse minority in Kashmir, like Kashmiri Pandit women who are merely 1.8% before the genocide of Kashmiri Pandits? So this is just what she has mentioned. I'm not able to. Yeah, ma'am is here actually. Dr.
Yeah.
Manorma.
I think Simi, you have exactly spoken what I mean to say. But apart from that, what I mean to say is that these are two different things. One thing is Kashmiri Pandit women who have been completely shunned prior to genocide of Kashmiri Pandits. Kashmiri Pandits were just 1.7% of the total population, while as the Muslims were 98 point some percentage. So when it comes to the seats and other kind of things also, Kashmiri Pandits had a very, the last pie they had to take, whatever breadcrumbs were there, that was for them. And when they would go in the, pan India for any kind of seats and other things, they were being told that they are the, majority population being Hindus. So there also, that's why we coined this word, the reverse minority for Kashmiri Pandits. Saying so, I mean, as a woman, I don't talk only about the Kashmiri Pandit women, but I also talk about the Kashmiri Muslim women. Like, they have been used by these jihadis, wherein like they are supplying the arms and ammunition. There have been lots of incidents wherein under the disguise of parda, they were sort of taking the arms. I'm talking about 90s and in 2013, 14, those kind of things, wherein like they were also involved into planners and patterns of the militancy, and some of them, if you know, like Dutra and Millet and Andrabi and all that, who had come and who had actually, I mean, they used to put acid on the women if they are not using the parda and all that, and that was the condition at that moment. And Kashmiri Hindu women were forced to put bindi to show their, identity. So, so that they can also be identified. So my question is like, when we are talking, I think we need to look it from, I have not heard the whole conversation, but we need to look it not from the religious angle only. We need to look it from the gender lens. How women are going through all this, whether it's a Kashmiri Hindu or Kashmiri Muslim woman, and we have to look it from a very different lens, and that is the lens of gender, a woman. So that is what I wanted to sort of like, so that I could get answer to these kind of questions, which have not actually come up in general, you know, parlays of discussions.
Right.
Yes.
Dr. Manorama Bakshi works with as a senior advisor at Tata Trust and works throughout India, and also work on these issues also on minority. So really thankful, Manorama ma'am, so that you can come up and really also mention the Kashmir side of story. Dr. Gudavarti works a lot on this Kashmir and also Chhattisgarh Naxalite belts. Yes, Dr. Gudavarti, I'm trying to connect few more people, but we can be brief and yes, now really wrap. Yes, over to you.
Yeah, I think we are on the same page. I think she agrees. Dr. Manoram also feels that I think through the gender entry point, once we begin to frame, I think even the Kashmir question, we can see it very, very differently. So that beyond this majority minority thing, that nature of violence itself, I think, can be framed differently. So we agree. I don't think there's much to disagree or discuss there. So we agree that gender will help us to frame the question differently. Yeah, Arjun.
Yes, sir. Indu sir, would you like
Yes,
to?
my dear.
Yes.
Yeah, no, I think, I believe that most of the questions have been, taken up by, and, it's time that, I think we thank him for the important, points that he raised, until we have got some questions further to ask him or to elaborate on the points he made. Because I think surely, when we have these discussions, it is not that we're asking for total acceptance of what is being said. I think we can have a points of disagreement. And I would appreciate that, this is kind of a conversation we are having. And what, in fact, Ajay spoke about was very interesting from the perspective of understanding Islamophobia and its Western moorings and all. And I think he tried to present an interesting perspective of how cultural, I think contextual communalism vis-a-vis some phobia is there. And we had some very interesting discourses and conversations. And I think, Ajay, we would like to thank you for your interesting presentation. And we look forward to, maybe there are some questions that we raised here or certain observations, which you can also use in your further write-ups and studies and all, which will enrich, I think, your observations and also will get further enriched. And we'll surely use, we always again invite you for your presentation in this forum and platform. And thank you for taking your time.
Yes.
It was nice to have you here.
Govind, would you
And,
like to say anything as concluding remarks? Professor Govind.
I think it is, I concluded well. I enjoyed the discussion, and I agree with Dr. Indu Prakash Singh. So that is the, I think, final word is spoken. And it has been, late also, long.
Yes.
Yeah. So we ended with a Zindabad to the work that you're doing and for your analysis.
Zindabad for whom?
Zindabad for the spirit to continue the struggle, Govindji.
Yes.
Zindabad to annihilate contextual communalism. Zindabad to establish secularism further.
Yes.
We have to be diehard optimists. We can't be pessimists. So Zindabad for that, not for what's happening in the country at the moment. Zindabad for the spirit of fighting it out.
I know you, so I meant it, but I thought.
Thank you, Govindji. Thank you,
everyone. Thank you, Professor Gudavarti, for really coming in.
Thank you.
Thank you, my dear. Thank you.
Have a nice day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.